One of the unique characteristics of the Institute is its proven skill in convening meetings between people who would not otherwise meet each other.
The early 80s were a tense period. There was some people called it the Second Cold War, or the Little Cold War. And that was the climate in which John Rose tried to pull together some people to have serious conversations about how we could avoid some of the worst case outcomes and how we could have real conversations with Soviets about improving that situation.
John managed, even at that time, to gather a group of very interesting people around him and around the Institute. And as I say, they had very grand ideas, which at the time we thought were grand ideas and now seem to be grand realities.
The idea behind the Institute of bringing East and West together intrigued me and was something that I felt rather strongly about personally.
A friend of ours who was the Polish ambassador to the United Nations, he called to say he had joined or was joining a new board, a new nonprofit group in America to cement cordial relationships between America and the Eastern Bloc.
The Institute was one of the rare places in the West in the 1980s that gave a serious voice to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. There was a tendency at the time to glob the whole of Central and Eastern Europe together into a homogeneous bloc.
The discussions were honest, no holds barred, what diplomats called, quote, full and frank discussions, unquote.
In 1987, there was a great deal of uncertainty about whether Gorbachev was real.
He seemed to have a new dynamism, a new charisma about him. There was some indication that there were some new reforms underway.
There were a number of people who said, don't fall for this deception.
Was this just another new, more sophisticated PR act on the part of the Kremlin, or was this really a new departure in Soviet foreign policy?
And our study group basically came to the conclusion, as we said in one of the first chapters, Gorbachev is real. There are real changes going on, and we ought to try to meet them halfway.
And this resulted in a report which was widely publicized and widely disseminated throughout the United States and Europe.
The report did stir some interest. It was a front page story in the New York Times.
And I really do think it made a difference. And it influenced, it shaped thinking in the U.S. presidential administration about how Gorbachev should be seen and that we should take Gorbachev seriously. There was a period after the fall of the Berlin Wall where it wasn't that difficult for the Institute to get its voice heard, but actually the Institute was faced with the challenge of, okay, what do we do now?
The Cold War is over. EWI was set up to address the Cold War. Why shouldn't we disband? So there's an active debate in the board. The board decided no, there's a job to be done.
I was at that point at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Czechoslovakia and happened to meet John Rose. I was very excited about both his ideas about the post-communist world and about all the changes that we were facing at that time, and also about what at that point was a very initial idea or plan to create a branch of the EastWest Institute somewhere in Central Europe.
An agreement was reached with the new government in Czechoslovakia for the Institute to lease a Stiržin castle which belonged to the Ministry of Education, and this gave the Institute a foothold in the region, which was perhaps one of the first Western organizations to have a foothold in the region.
And in this very civilized setting, we brought people together to exchange ideas.
The Institute has always been very responsive and driven by the local needs. So it didn't come into the region with its own kind of set agenda.
Among the early work that was crucial was an effort to bring together the leaders, the new leaders of these countries who didn't have deep relationships with their Western counterparts. And we were able to bring them together in informal, off-the-record settings to help them build relationships, grapple with the really difficult challenges, get advice. And then we found that we needed, after a few years of that, to actually take our work out of Prague and into the other countries, so we began to set up satellite centers.
It was the fact that they were willing to get their hands dirty on the ground. I had a sort of burning desire to do work in the Balkans. I'd seen the region blow up. My sense was that they were able to marry up access at policy level in a sort of way that could have influence with real work on the ground that could deliver benefits to communities.
One of the traditional trademarks of the Institute, that it was always going beyond ideas and beyond research. It was always looking at ways how to implement some of those ideas into reality.
We set up a field office in Gnilane, Kosovo, to start to re-establish relations across the border with South Serbia and with Macedonia. And one of the most amazing moments, I think, to watch was the first time that Kosovar children, actually both of both ethnic communities, came. We were able to bring them on a sort of school exchange trip to southern Serbia, and many of their parents came along with them. And apart from the security concerns, getting them across the border and so on and so forth, which is a big thing, it was this extraordinary moment of having children playing together and having their parents watch that.
The so-called FRY task force, it was a project in the former, it was at that point called former Republic of Yugoslavia.
We thought it would be useful to try to connect the growing opposition community in Serbia with people in Europe and in the United States who could be supportive of them.
As a very low-key, quiet project, I think it was in 1999, when Milosevic was still in power. And the question was how to promote change in such a country which was very much closed, governed by military and security forces, etc.
The Institute organized a major conference in Bratislava and brought together these democratic opposition figures and civil society leaders from Serbia with leaders from Central and Eastern Europe who had been through these changes. And
basically we provided for them a platform where they were able to discuss how to start cooperating and how to create a new platform and vision for Serbia and Montenegro as democratic states.
Our colleagues from Serbia showed up right at the time that Milosevic surprised everybody and said he was going to call early elections. And I remember very profoundly how nervous everybody at the conference was, and they didn't know what to do. And they thought, well, we know the elections won't be fair, so should we instead organize a boycott and tell people not to vote and delegitimize the process? And we worked through it and convinced them, no, this was their moment of opportunity. And in fact, they shouldn't boycott the election. They should go back to Serbia, back to Yugoslavia, and organize to win the elections, which was a very courageous thing for them to do, and they did. And we provided support in that process, and in the elections in that fall, in October, Milosevic ultimately was forced out of office.
Well, like the world, the Institute has broadened out. It's no longer East-West in the old sense of the term, but it's really almost global.
Once again, the Institute was able to overcome many of the skeptics who thought, well, you know, this institute really has its history in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and what can it bring to the challenges of the Middle East, or what can it possibly do with regard to China? And the Institute has proven again that it has the capacity to learn, to reinvent, to attract new partners, and to build bridges and build relationships that have impact. In many respects, China is going to be the big story of the 21st century. And again, the Institute, without much prior experience or relationship, was able to quietly but quickly establish very high-level relations of trust with Chinese leaders.
Relationships between the major powers remain important, so US-China is a fundamental sort of a plank of our work, as is US Russia.
In 2001, when Putin was very young in his presidency, and George Bush was also very young in his presidency, and there was talk that the relationship would tank completely. At that point in time, EWI, and it was an experience that I took part in, set up a visit with Putin, with Putin's blessing, which allowed us and a bunch of senators, U.S. senators, to review and go and talk to everybody we wanted in Russia, and then report back to the White House. And the impression I got was that the President of the United States took heed, and that allowed for a certain amelioration and in his approach.
Well, where we deliver our best results is where we bring together people who are not normally talking to each other on a specific problem of international relations. That can be big things like the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, or in a sense it can be sub-elements of foreign policy. So between the United States and Russia today, we had a very big impact on the question of ballistic missile defense. And by bringing together people from both sides to do a joint threat assessment or a joint assessment on Iran's missile and nuclear capability, we were able to provide a narrowing of the differences between the United States and Russia.
And I think that some of the work that we started in 2007, 2008 at the Track 2 level helped set the stage for this administration to better understand what it is that was in the Russian mindset in terms of what bothered them about the relationship, and helped us over the last 2 years reset this relationship, which resulted, as we all know, in the START treaty at the end of last year.
But what we're finding, even in the work with Russia and China, is that they're interested in the global issues, and the US and Russia need to get together to talk about global issues now, not so much bilateral issues, and it's certainly the same with US-China.
Borders simply don't mean what they used to mean, and the organisation has evolved well to capture our sort of borderless societies today, including, of course, the borderless nature of security challenges that we face.
Yeah, I think that a very clear, kind of tangible response to this new global dimension of threat and challenge to security was creation of a new global forum where the new security threats started to be discussed, and this was World Security Conference, which was started in Brussels, and became a really first forum where the new players came together to discuss how to protect people and infrastructure. And we are talking about, as I mentioned, we are talking about public and private sectors, about civil society. We are talking about not only Western powers, but also about the emerging powers ranging from Russia to China to India.
One thing that's happened in EWI in the last 3 to 4 years, especially in the area of cybersecurity, is that we're working much more closely with business leaders. So whereas in the 1980s we brought together national security officials, politicians and academic experts, we're now having to bring together business leaders.
Cybersecurity and all aspects of cyber have become a focus of the Institute's work currently. We all know the danger of lack of ability in this day and age to communicate essential information very fast. And malign activity could threaten our financial markets, our household expenditure, and all sorts of other areas. And that's where we began the discussion of this.
By about 2009, it became obvious that this was a big new agenda item globally that was not being addressed effectively by the global institutions. And through 2009 and through 2010, we committed very strongly to this agenda, and we've already seen huge buy-in from leading corporations to what we're doing and governments.
And I think now cybersecurity is one area that is very important for the Institute. And they successfully, Institute did a big summit in Dallas. It's very much involved into dialogues between different states on future of cybersecurity.
This is something which is as important to us today as the nuclear revolution was a half century ago, but in which we are probably at the same stage today as the world was in 1950 in terms of thinking about nuclear.
And the Dallas Cybersecurity Summit was one way in which we sort of established ourselves on the global stage.
So the fact that the Institute is on the cutting edge again of an issue like cybersecurity, I think is an indication of successful adaptation.
Well, I'm a strong believer that EWI is an organization that can reinvent itself and adjust to the new conditions in the global environment.
So each decade, EWI has looked and felt very different.
I think partly it's because it is very flexible, very willing to seize on an opportunity. There aren't too many sunk costs, so a problem is identified, interest is generated, and we tend to move in that direction with the same approach, which is not simply to be a think tank, but actually to act as well.
In modern life, when things change quickly from day to day, new issues arise, new challenges, there is a need of institutions, organizations that can act quickly.
It's about building trust. It's about breaking down barriers to communications with, say, the Chinese, with Russians.
For me, it was a new world of negotiations. Usually my world was very direct, very formal, very scripted, very polite, very diplomatic. And in these track 2 sessions, I found that you could roll up your sleeves and you could show emotion, and you didn't have to worry too much about hurting anybody's feelings or having your feelings hurt, because you were talking very directly. And I thought there was a very healthy thing to be able to do, and so I became a big fan of EastWest Institute, and I still am, and I consider it to be a national asset.